In the early 1800s, some whites looked to rid the country of slavery, and in doing so, they sought to send the blacks off to another country, somewhere that was far away over in Africa, where most of them at this time knew nothing about. And this plan to ship them off was, in a sense, a very slick way to avoid dealing with the trauma, the mental health conditions, and the societal problems that these people would present after enduring nearly 2 centuries of mental destruction, right? And so let's talk about it. And for us to do so, we're going to read from the book here. It's called The Black Image in the White Mind by historian Dr. George M. Fredrickson. So let's turn in here to page 3, where he writes this. As Jefferson put it in Notes on Virginia, it was impossible to
incorporate the blacks into the state
because
deep-rooted prejudices entertained by the whites.
This is the fruit bearing from the seeds of hatred, disdain, destruction, and white supremacy sown by the colonists in the 1600s. Seeds that were sown by a bunch of money-greedy and power-hungry men. And Jefferson knew all of the history that we've been going over, plus way more that was never revealed in the books. And from all of that information and all of the knowledge that he had, he concluded that it would be impossible to incorporate the blacks into the state. And that's because of the prejudices inside of the white consciousness. Now let's hear some more.
10,000 recollections by the blacks of the injuries they have sustained.
Physical injuries, but the more traumatic were the emotional and the psychological injuries that destroyed those they called blacks.
The real distinctions nature has made, and many other circumstances will divide us into parties and produce convulsions, which will probably never end, but in the extermination of one or the other race.
That's how bad the energy was between the two during Jefferson's time. Now, it's not anywhere close to that level today, but there's still some thickness in the air. And that's because on both sides, very few people have done the real shadow work and have addressed this topic with open honesty and with the intent of being able to move forward from the black and white thing, right? But let's keep reading. The belief that the Negro, if freed, would remain an alien and troublesome presence seemed confirmed in the early 19th century by the situation of those blacks who, after the Revolution, had been emancipated in the North or manumitted privately in the South. It was the son of one of the leaders of the successful emancipation movement in Connecticut who suggested in 1834 that the manumissions of the late 18th century may have set back the cause of emancipation nationally. The bad practical effects of these actions were a consequence of
the corrupted characters of the manumitted slaves.
And where did they develop this corrupt character from? The pits of American slavery, which was an environment that bred corrupt character and counterproductive culture by the very nature of that system. And now we see here a member of the Free Society stating that the way that these free blacks are behaving, this might make us think twice about the country releasing more of them. Here we go. Their change in condition
was fruitful in crime, but rarely productive of happiness.
Meaning the transition from enslaved to physically free people did not make the blacks happier, but made them become criminals. This is what he's talking about. Indeed, from the very beginning of the gradual emancipation process in the North, the conduct of newly freed Negroes was an embarrassment to some of those who hoped most fervently for the rapid demise of slavery. In 1798, a group of New Jersey abolitionists reported that many free blacks were
given to idleness, frolicking, drunkenness, and in some few cases to dishonesty.
And this is coming from people who actually wanted slavery to end, so it gives much more credibility to the accuracy of this report. It's not like it's coming from the mouth of slave owners who may be making things up because of their affiliation with the slave system. So yes, the free blacks were more than likely doing all of these things plus a whole lot more. And it's understandable to an extent because of the consciousness and the culture they inherited, plus the society that was surrounding them, right? That was encouraging this behavior. Now let's keep reading. In 1806, a leading Pennsylvania abolitionist described most Philadelphia Negroes as
degraded and vicious.
My wife is from West Philadelphia, and her parents eventually found a way to get out of that area because of this very reason. And I went over there to see the area they lived in, and I can see how 200 years later, Many of them, not all, but many, could be described the same, right? It's an environmental, systematic mentality and a cultural thing that's behind this. And a strong intention and desire has to be behind climbing out of that pit, or the cycle continueth. And they'll simply keep passing on what it is they have inherited, right? And sometimes what is inherited is not always what allows people to thrive. And this seems to be the case with the Philadelphia Negroes, who they described as
degraded and vicious.
Let's keep going. And 2 years later, the New York Manumission Society announced that it viewed
with regret the looseness of manners and depravity of conduct in many of the persons of color in this city.
You see that? So again, another anti-slavery group disappointed with the behavior of blacks. And they obviously interpreted this conduct as the result of being destroyed in slavery. But nonetheless, it was still something that needed to be dealt with. Of course, these humanitarians generally attributed black depravity to environmental factors, the heritage of slavery and the conditions under which free Negroes were forced to live. But they nevertheless unwittingly provided an argument against further acts of liberation. They said, we know this conduct stems from the blacks being traumatized in slavery, but we have to take a break from allowing more of them to hit the streets because it's not looking good out here. If it was true that American society turned free Negroes into a depraved population by refusing them decent treatment and adequate opportunities, then practical men might be led to conclude, on the basis of this consequence alone, that emancipation was undesirable. Another important point to address is that even when the blacks were freed, many whites still refused to treat them fairly. They denied them job and housing opportunities, which kept the cycle of oppression alive. And it also kept the inherited slave mentality alive in the blacks. And this is why Dr. Fredrickson is noting that some concluded that it was better not to let them free at all, based upon the consequences of this unjust treatment. The northern image of the free Negro as a social danger came into sharper focus as time went on. In Massachusetts, a state with a very small black population that had abolished slavery almost without controversy, a serious concern with free Negro depravity developed in the 1820s. In 1821, the legislature appointed a committee to look into the possibility of restricting Negro immigration on the grounds that blacks constituted
a species of population that could become both injurious and burdensome.
In 1826, the Board of Managers of the Boston Prison Discipline Society, an organization for penal reform, pointed out in their first annual report that Negroes constituted a disproportionately large percentage of the prison population of the northeastern states, and concluded that
the first cause existing in society of the frequency and increase of crime is the degraded character of the colored population.
That's in 1826, where they were saying the free blacks were making up a disproportionately large percentage of people in the prison system. And this is in the Northeast, and this is before the vast majority of the enslaved in the South were set free. So think about that, and then think about today, where the descendants of those people also make up a disproportionately large percentage of the inmates. That's because the cycle continueth, right? And the Boston Prison Discipline Society contributed this cause to the
degraded character of the colored population.
Let's keep going. The use here of the adjective degraded, which was constantly applied to free Negroes during this period, suggested that there was some ideal of manhood from which the Negro had fallen or to which he might be raised, and the Prison Discipline Society readily conceded that an appropriation for black education equal to the cost of maintaining black convicts
would very soon raise their character to a level of whites and diminish the number of convicts from among them about tenfold.
But the Boston prison reformers had no real expectation that such an ambitious program of Negro uplift would be adopted, and they moved quickly to endorse an alternative solution, the removal of the free blacks by colonizing them abroad. Here we go. They were looking to get them out of here. In advocating this approach to the problem, they were falling in line with the enlightened philanthropy of the day, which had settled on African colonization as the panacea that would not only solve the free Negro crisis, but also open the way to the gradual extinction of slavery. They hoped that by shipping Negroes to Africa, that it would relieve them of dealing with the crime problem, and simultaneously it would get rid of the destructive and criminal slave system from the country. So the 2-for-1 special was what they were looking for. The new colonization movement, which began with the founding of the American Colonization Society in 1817, was in many respects typical of the benevolent movements which burgeoned between the War of 1812 and the late 1820s. The Colonization Society, like the other benevolent organizations, originated through the initiative of a clergyman. The principal instigator was the Reverend Robert Finley, a Presbyterian of Basking Ridge, New Jersey, and once established, it received the overwhelming support of the evangelical establishment and the Calvinist clergy. It became customary by the 1820s for many Northern ministers, especially Congregationalists and Presbyterians, to give special Independence Day sermons endorsing the cause of African colonization and seeking support for the Society's Liberian colony, which received its first settlers in 1822. And I believe there were about 88 blacks that originally settled in Liberia. There were more that came later, but I think there was about 88 that originally came. But the rest of the blacks were not going for it. They had enough reasoning ability here to see that the whites were trying to get them out of America so they didn't have to deal with the problem they helped create, right? That reasoning faculty was working perfectly fine here, right? No question about it, because most of them, the vast majority of them were not going for this, right? Africa was already done and over with, right? That was more than 200 years ago and a distant memory for the vast majority of them. But for a few of them, they still saw it as home, which is no problem with that. But here we go. The specifically religious appeal of the movement came from its claim to be a missionary enterprise. A colony of converted ex-slaves would, it was argued, contribute to the conversion and redemption of Africa. For men of this background and mentality, the free Negroes were bound to present a problem in that they constituted an other inadequately controlled and unpredictable element in a social situation that seemed to offer many threats to order, stability, and hierarchy. General emancipation in the North and the manumission of many slaves in the Upper South had been aspects of a general loosening of traditional social controls, which had begun in the Revolutionary era, and here as elsewhere, conservative men had to face the consequences of a new order in society and politics. On the surface, at least, the colonizationist attitude toward the free Negro often resembled the attitude of contemporary philanthropists toward drunkards, infidels, and people moving west too fast for the churches to keep up with them. Like other newly and perhaps too hastily liberated elements, they constituted a threat to the order and decorum of society. Decorum of society is the polite and respectable behavior expected in a society, and it varies depending on the society. So they believed that the free Negroes would threaten their decorum of society in addition to their established order.
There is a point,
wrote one colonizationist,
beyond which the peace of society cannot permit the increase of the elements of commotion.
With the growth of the free black population, that point seemed about to be reached. In the North, the problem was the one pointed out by the Boston Prison Discipline Society in 1826, namely that blacks allegedly contributed to the idleness, disorderliness, and criminality of the urban poor. In the South, there was an even more pressing danger. As Robert Goodloe Harper pointed out in 1817,
the free people of color
were
a nuisance and burden,
not only because their poverty brought the social costs of pauperism, vice, and crime, but also because they
contribute greatly to the corruption of the slaves and to aggravate the evils of their condition by rendering them idle, discontented, and disobedient.
So free blacks were looked at as disruptive to the plantation order, and they were somehow encouraging the slaves to not listen to their master and do as little work as possible, which for sure made the masters hot. The dissatisfaction they inspired could eventuate in direct resistance to the master's authority. The danger of slave unrest and rebellion in the South was a recurring theme of colonizationist literature, but it would be wrong to conclude from this that all or even most of the leading exponents of colonization wanted to remove the free Negro merely to provide for the safety and security of the institution of slavery, as the abolitionists charged in the 1830s. On the contrary, many of them saw the danger of bloody rebellion and a repetition of the scenes of San Domingo, Haiti, as inherent in servitude itself, For this and other reasons, they represented their cause as the only practical long-range solution to the menace of slavery. In 1828, a statement of the Connecticut Colonization Society pointed to the possibility that if slavery were not abolished by the gradual and voluntary means that colonizationists advocated, it would come to an end as a result of violence and insurrection. Henry Clay, the major political spokesman for colonization, also argued that the slave system contained within itself the seeds of insurrection and race war. In the same letter describing the free Negro as a threat to the peace of the plantation, Harper defended colonization precisely because
it tends and may powerfully tend to rid us gradually and entirely in the United States of slaves and slavery, a great moral and political evil of increasing virulence and extent.
In 1830, the Reverend Robert J. Breckinridge, a principal advocate of the movement in Kentucky, declared that
the political moral of the Colonization Society is strikingly plain. It has taught us how we may be relieved of the curse of slavery in an advantageous way to both parties.
Other leading colonizationists were equally frank about their desire for the gradual destruction of the slave system. Their oft-repeated argument was that the main obstacle to gradual emancipation came from white opposition to a free Negro population within the United States, and that colonization would encourage voluntary manumission at an increasing rate by offering a way of freeing slaves without augmenting the degraded classes of society. That's how manumission was marketed. The slaves could be freed and then sent to other places like Liberia, so the society didn't have to deal with the huge problem created by the early English colonists and their later white descendants. Slavery was considered an evil by colonizationists not because they had any empathy with the sufferings of the slaves. They were notably deficient in this regard, but because they viewed it as an economically unsound and dangerous institution, incompatible in the long run with the prosperity, peace, and security of society. In a speech before the Kentucky Colonization Society in 1830, Henry Clay, who had taken a leading role in the movement from the beginning, cataloged the economic evils of the institution as an inefficient system of labor, and then went on to present his view that slavery was a potential state of war that would eventually erupt into open conflict. It was probable, he argued, that slave insurrections would increase in the future, for Negroes
are rational beings like ourselves, capable of feeling and reflection and of judging what belongs to them as a portion of the human race.
That's right. And they were rational enough to not let themselves be shipped to a place that they were utterly unfamiliar with, right? I could tell you that much. No one was questioning if they were intellectually inferior in this instance, right? But here's what else Henry Clay had to say.
By the very condition of the relation which exists between us, we are enemies of each other.
The blacks, he continued, were well aware of their grievances, and only the power of the whites kept them from avenging their wrongs. Clay's remarks suggest that at least some of the colonizationists of the 1820s and 1830s did not share the belief of later racists in the inherent slavishness and irrationality of the Negro. As rational beings like ourselves, Negroes reacted to slavery precisely as white men would react, hence the danger of insurrection. But if blacks were fully rational, it might be asked, why was it not possible to educate them up to the level of the whites, thereby opening the way to gradual emancipation without colonization? Easy answer, because they tried to slither out of doing that part. Now, how wild would it have been if they had just destroyed their minds, used them up to get wealthy, and then just shipped them off somewhere to never deal with the repercussions of the problem they helped create, right? That would have been super wild. But that's not how it works, right? People always have to reap the harvest that they've sown. And so again, the question is, why couldn't they just help lift the Negroes up through education without trying to ship them off somewhere? And here is Dr. Fredrickson's answer. Because the colonizationists were unwilling to undertake this task or envision the possibility of its accomplishment, the analogy between their movement and other benevolent enterprises ultimately breaks down. The white drunkard, criminal, or infidel could be persuaded by missionaries and philanthropists to reform and become a respectable or harmless member of society, but not the emancipated Negro. To understand exactly why the theorists of colonization believed that the Negro alone could not be assimilated, it is necessary to look more closely at their racial ideas and assumptions. And that's what we'll take a closer look at in the next video. But hopefully you've learned something valuable from this video. And if you've been someone following along for some time, you should be able to clearly see that there's a lot of history that was skimmed over in school. And there's a big gap that needs to be filled, not only with the historical information, but with the interpretation of the information, because the interpretation is one of the major keys, along with how you apply the interpretation in your life. So we have to understand that and be very aware of that, right? So that's it for us for right now. I want to thank you for watching all the way into the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.